Chapter 314. The Enslaved Bride, Part 11. Malwal pretended to be a worker, and went to seek recruitment in Hajrodwan slaves' farms. He did not allow Olivia to accompany him in such a dangerous and risky mission. He knew that the supervisors and the workers would harass Olivia, due to her beauty and young age, and might kill him if he tried to stop them from raping her. After a couple of hours' wait, Malwal and many other workers were stuffed like sheep, in a lorry. The lorry had no roof to protect them from the blazing sun's rays and heat. They had no food or water, but they were told that their first meal would be served to them at the farms. Some of the workers had packed food, which they had purchased, in the city before they left. Malwal happened to be one of those wise workers. Compassion led him to share some of his food with a poor southern woman, who had 3 children and nothing to eat or drink. He was shocked when he learned that the woman's little ones were counted among the workers. None of them had yet reached 10 years. Hajrodwan cheated all those he recruited that year, and sent them to the Sawoud farms, instead of the fowl farms. Some of the workers discovered, on their way to the farms, that they were going to Darfur instead of Kurdistan. When they protested, they were threatened by their supervisors that they would be abandoned in the wilderness. Then they would have to walk for many hours on foot to return to the city. On their way back, the wolves and the Hambata might attack them. None of them could risk taking such a journey back to El Fasher. After a day and a night of driving, the lorry reached the farms. The poor woman told Malwal that some workers lived permanently at the farms. He decided to look there for Ayan, and as soon as he found her, they would escape together. Malwal's luck sent him to the first farm along the way. The lorry resumed its journey as soon as the selected workers had jumped down from it. Along with 6 other men, 2 women, and 5 children, Malwal walked on foot for 2 hours from the place where the lorry had dropped them off, to the camp, where they were supposed to stay and work for 3 months. They were half dead, thirsty, and starving when they reached the camp. The camp was made up of 4 huts that were built in the middle of each farmyard to house the workers. 3 of those huts were already fully inhabited by workers, and the 4th one had little room left for newcomers. Most of the workers were women and children from the south. Malwal could imagine how those poor southerners had gotten here. At least 15 to 20 people lived in each hut. There was no toilet in the camp. The workers had to go to the wilderness to answer the call of nature. They had to do both jobs right out in the open. Most of the workers took a bath only once a month, and during the rain they might also get a free shower. Every worker was expected to prepare his own food, was given some flour and dried fish. This was the workers' diet for the entire 3 months. To add variety to this bland repast, some would look for edible insects or animals in the wilderness. 2 types of animals, which could easily be caught, were rabbits and rats. Rats were more readily available than rabbits. The rats were called holes pigeons by the workers, the dried fish were called kajik, and the flour was known as banak arbo. Kajik fish had an unbelievable nasty smell when it dried up. One could smell it even if it was cooked in the oven for 5 hours. The only way to get rid of its pungent odor was to eat it up. In spite of its smell, kajik fish had a very good taste. Banak arbo flour was cooked as a saida, which could be described as baked wet bread. It could be made out of any kind of grain. What transferred the grain into banak arbo flour was the added ingredient. Some leaves of a tree called karad were dried, grind, and added to the flour. These leaves were believed to be the same kind of substance the ancient Egyptians used to embalm the bodies of their pharaohs. As the karad kept the pharaohs' bodies embalmed for thousands of years, so the food remained inside the stomachs of the workers for a very long time. A worker would not feel the need to go to the wilderness toilet for a week or so. And when he did finally feel the need to go, he would experience the same labor a woman would go through before she delivered her baby. There was wisdom behind feeding the workers banak arbo. The workers were expected to work from sunrise to sunset. The Bannock Arbo would kill their appetites and keep them from wasting time going to the toilet, and when they experienced the pain, they would not eat much of it again. Malwal experienced the most horrifying night in his life on the eve of his first day in the camp. The howling of wolves, the biting of mosquitoes, and the moving scorpions and snakes drove the sleep from his eyes. He spent all night sitting on top of his bed and fighting with the mosquitoes, which he felt as though they had sucked half of his blood. Before daybreak, all the workers were forced out of their beds. They were not offered tea or breakfast. In fact, breakfast was a luxury meal in Sudan anyway, thus no one would dream of having it at the farm. Before sleeping, the workers had eaten Bannock Arbo and Kajik. None of them had washed their faces or brushed their teeth, except for Malwal. They smelled terribly when they began to issue out of the 4 grave-like caves. The work began at 5 o'clock a.m. The first stage of the work was to cut off the little bushes and grasses, which grew naturally. This task was supposed to finish before the rain began to fall. The next stage was to plant the seeds. In planting the seeds, the worker had to do 3 jobs at the same time. He had to dig a small hole with a tool he carried in his hand, throw a few seeds inside the hole from a sack attached to his back, and use his foot to bury the seeds. When this stage was over, the workers sometimes got a little time to rest, until the seeds grew. Anything that was not planted and came up with the seed had to be weeded. This removal of unwanted grasses would go on until the seeds became trees, ripe for cultivation. Then, the following 5 steps previously mentioned, would follow, one after another. First of all, Haj Rodwan had farms in Kordofan and Darfur provinces in the western region of Sudan. In Kordofan, he grew al-Ful al-Sudani or Sudanese peanuts, and in Darfur, he grew tobacco, from which sawoud or snuff was made. Incidentally, the Sudanese peanuts are called Fusdak al-Abid in the Middle East by the Arabs, which means the peanuts of the slaves. The Sudanese snuff was considered internationally as an illegal drug, but in Sudan it was treated as one would other tobacco. It was the most frequently consumed type of tobacco in the country. The person who took this kind of tobacco would feel drugged, and a very nasty smell would emanate from his mouth. Prolonged use of this snuff caused lip or tongue cancer. Most of the workers would have liked to avoid working in the sawoud farms and would have preferred working in the Ful farms. This was a problem for which Haj Rodwan could not find a solution. He forced the poor southern girls whom he stole every year from the Dinka villages, to grow and cultivate his sawoud farms. When the sawoud trees were being planted, there was no serious problem facing the workers. The problem started when the trees became ripe and ready for harvest. The first step was to pluck off the leaves. The second step was to dry them under the blazing sun of Africa. The third step was to gather them in heaps. The fourth step was to grind them into a powder. The fifth step was to pour the powder into sacks. The sixth, and the last step, was to carry those sacks and load them in lorries. These 6 steps were called the cultivation period, which takes the longest time in the process of growing sawoud. During this long period, the poor workers go through the most painful and dangerous experience in their lives. Symptoms of exposure to sawoud included coughing, sneezing, weeping, drowsiness, suffocation, vomiting, fainting, getting drugged and feeling nauseated. Besides that, some dangerous lungs diseases such as tuberculosis and cancer were very common diseases among the sawoud workers. For that reason, any ordinary worker would have rather preferred to become a bar milo than a sawoud cultivator. Only slaves, who had no choice, would be forced to do such dangerous work. Because Malwal was a Sudanese American, life was difficult for him from the very first day on the farm. He had little knowledge of Sudanese agriculture or vegetation. For example, most of the workers knew about a vegetable that grew wild and was called dog's onions. It would be less dangerous to touch a cobra or a live coal than to touch that vegetable. The wise workers, who knew about the infamous onion, would use something to cover their hands when they pulled it. Sadly, that day our friend Malwal used his bare hands to weed out the dog's onions. His reaction and loud screams made the other workers wonder if a poisonous flying snake, the Abudraga, had struck him. The workers ran away from Malwal to avoid a possible encounter with the dreaded snake. Malwal rolled on the ground, kicking his feet as if though he were having a seizure. After a tense pause, the workers realized Malwal had not been bitten but rather had touched dog's onions because he was still alive and struggling, not dead. There was no medicine or remedy for the dog's onions, except to leave its victim to suffer until the burning sensation subsided. Once the sensation had stopped, Malwal wanted to return to the hut and take the day off. The supervisor refused to accept that excuse, and forced him to carry on with his work, taking more caution than before. That day, Malwal faced a lot of other minor natural disasters. While cutting the little bushes and grasses, nothing serious came his way, like the dog's onions, but other grasses that he was also supposed to handle with caution but did not, Mawira and Haskanit. Mawira had thorns for protection which it hid. Its victim would feel the trouble without seeing the thorns, so there was no way that he could remove the thousands of thorns that entered his skin. He could understand God giving a plant thorns for self-defense, but Malwal wondered why God endowed dog's onions with burning acid. The onion was hidden under the ground, and a person or animal would not see until he pulled the entire vegetable. Haskanit had no thorns or burning juice, but it just liked to stick to any creature that came near it. By the time Malwal returned to his hut, he felt like a moving sack of Haskanit. On the second day Malwal was wiser and escaped many of those trouble-making grasses. While he was working that day, he engaged in conversation with some southern women. He inquired about their condition and how they were brought there. The majority lived there permanently, and Malwal heard stories of how they were kidnapped, beaten, raped, and brought forcibly to the farms by the Arab Janjaweed. Malwal also asked about his missing bride, Ayan. None of the women claimed to have seen or heard of a girl by that name, from the village Malwal mentioned. They told him he would not be allowed to visit other farms to search for his girl. It was against the rules of farming to leave the work and go and visit other farms. Vicious dogs and armed guards guarded each farm. This piece of information discouraged Malwal. He began to think about escaping from the farm and returning to the city. Malwal was stuck on that farm for 3 days and 3 nights before heaven worked a miracle, and helped him to escape. On the 4th morning, when the supervisor counted the workers, Malwal was found missing. The supervisor searched for Malwal everywhere, and even sent ferocious dogs and guards with guns to trace Malwal, but they could not find him. Although Malwal was able to escape, with supernatural help, from the slaves' farm, he needed something more than a miracle to return to El Fasher city. First of all, how he could go back to that city. If he managed to escape the wild beasts of the wilderness, he would not be able to avoid the Hambada. The Hambada are armed highway robbers. Their robberies are considered by the Sudanese people as courageous deeds and so honored. Many books, plays, and TV serials were created to honor their robberies. Their deeds are likened to the raids of the Prophet Muhammad and his Mujahideen holy warriors. The Muslim Arabs' raids to Christian towns and villages in south of Sudan are given the same status of that of the Prophet and his raiders. Even if Malwal was neither attacked by the wild beasts nor by the human brutes, he would definitely fall into the hands of the devils on horses' backs. The Janjaweed are more dangerous than any other creatures on earth. The word Janjaweed in the Darfurian language means devils on horses. Once he reached a safe distance from the farm, Malwal stopped to think about his plan of action. He had neither a gun nor any local weapon to protect himself from a possible attack. He did not even know the way back to El Fasher city. Everything in that part of Sudan was hostile, even nature. The wilderness was teeming with all kinds of dangerous animals and insects such as poisonous snakes, scorpions, wolves, and hyenas. Whatever might befall him, he vowed never to return to that horrific slaves' camp. Malwal continued to walk aimlessly through the wilderness. He walked most of the time and rested only for short periods, before he resumed his journey. He hoped his feet would guide him to a nearby village, because he did not want to spend the night out in the open. Though it was hot and sunny day, the heat did not bother him. After a long walk, he found a narrow road which looked like it most probably led to a nearby village. He left the main road and for quite a distance, until at last, he reached a small village called Hilat Naga. Malwal entered the village at sunset. He felt great relief at having arrived safely. So far, he was fortunate, because neither beasts nor humans had attacked him in the wilderness. Nonetheless, if Malwal had known what was going to happen to that village, he would never have gone to it, preferring to face the danger of the wilderness rather than the attack of the Janjaweed. There was a reason the Sudanese government supported such dangerous militias as the Janjaweed, even though they usually attack a village, burn it out and kill its men, steal its cattle and property, rape its women, and enslave their little ones. The government does not consider the Janjaweed as lawless men or as a gang of robbers. They are also neither military soldiers nor policemen. They are well-trained and very organized militias. In order to justify their brutal attacks, the Janjaweed claimed to be the guardians of the Darfur province from the Fur rebels. The majority of residents in Hilat Naga village were from the Fur tribes, although it was also inhabited by various other Sudanese African tribes. Who were the Fur rebels? This requires some explanation to answer. In the south of Sudan, the rebels are a well-organized army who fought against the Sudanese army for years, until the Khartoum government was forced to sign fragile peace treaty with them. In Darfur, the rebels are still immature, and not well organized. Some groups in Darfur carried guns and rebelled against the government. They had different demands. One group wanted to free Darfur from the Sudanese Arabs' control. Another group called for justice, because they believed that Darfur province had been marginalized and ignored by the Khartoum government. In this, they are absolutely right. If one were to visit the northern, central, and eastern provinces of Sudan, and then travel to Darfur province, Noba Mountains, and the southern Sudanese provinces, one would not believe it is still the same country. Because of this and other reasons, the Southerners, Darfurians, and Nobas rebelled against the Arab government, and carried guns and fought for their rights. Other sore points were the racial discriminations and the lack of representation in the central government. From the time the British left Sudan 50 years previously until the present, no president was elected or rose to power through a coup from those marginalized provinces. All the presidents came from three dominating northern Arab tribes known as Jalia, Shajia, and Danagla. Since Sudan achieved its independence in January 1, 1956, some Southerners have carried guns and rebelled against the Arab-dominated government of Khartoum. The fight between the Southern rebels and the Sudanese army was called civil war for a long time, until Muslim Brothers seized power through a coup d'état in June 30, 1989. The Muslim Brotherhood government changed the civil war of the South into jihad, or a holy war. Thousands of fanatical Muslims joined the war and went to the south to kill the so-called Christian infidels. Their main goal was to Islamize the southern Christians. The government also called for compulsory recruitment of young boys, and sent them to kill or to die as martyrs in the south. With the lofty promise of the Quran that a Muslim martyr would marry 72 virgin girls in paradise, those mujahideen preferred to die rather than to kill. Accordingly, the notion of the wedding of the martyr was invented. When a family in the north received the sad news, or rather the good news for them, that their son was killed in the south, they would rejoice and celebrate his wedding in paradise with the 72 virgins. What might sound like a fairy tale to the Western reader was the reality in Sudan. The Janjaweed's attacks in Darfur could not be called holy war, as was the case in the south, for both the Janjaweed and the Fur rebels are Muslims. The Janjaweed and the Fur people had fought side by side in the south against the Southerners. What divided them was race. The Janjaweed claimed to be Sudanese Arabs and the other tribes of Darfur are pure African Sudanese. In fact, the Janjaweed militias were created before the Fur rebels took guns and began to attack military bases in Darfur. They were created under the pretense of defending Darfur and preventing the southern rebels from advancing into the western region of Sudan. When the Fur rebels carried guns, the government of Sudan turned the Janjaweed against the entire Sudanese African population that lived in Darfur. It was neither jihad, nor civil war, but ethnic cleansing. Many massacres, rapes, destructions, and genocides took place. The President of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, is now and has been the President of Sudan for 25 years. Given the circumstances, he might as well be the President for life. He was indicted by the International Criminal Court at Hague for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. An arrest warrant for President Omar al-Bashir was issued on March 4, 2009 by the International Criminal Court, indicting him on 5 accounts of crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, forcible transfer, torture, and rape, and 2 accounts of war crimes, pillaging and intentionally directing attacks against civilians. A second arrest warrant for President al-Bashir was later issued on July 12, 2010 by the International Criminal Court, adding 3 counts of genocide for the ethnic cleansing of the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa tribes of the Darfur region of western Sudan. Until today, July 3, 2017, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood and President of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, remains at large, wanted by the International Criminal Court. The Janjaweed always look for a small reason to justify their brutal attack on a village, then wipe it and its inhabitants out of existence. If a bullet is fired in a village against a military soldier or a Janjaweed fighter, that is enough reason to attack and burn out that village. Also, if a person entered a village and was suspected of being a rebel, that too would lead to a devastating attack. It so happened, that on the day Malwal by luck, or by fate, found that village, and decided to spend the night there, that an informant spotted him and reported the matter to the Janjaweed. One rebel entering a village, for the Janjaweed, represented a plague, that would spread over the entire village and turn them all into rebels by the morning. The leaders of the Janjaweed decided upon the destiny of that village, and waited for the right time to attack it. They informed the Air Force at El Fasher, and asked them to send a plane, as was the custom each time an attack took place. The military Air Force would bombard the village first and then the Janjaweed would attack. At dawn, the plane arrived, dropped its bombs on the village, and flew away. Malwal happened to be sleeping out in the open, a common practice in Sudan. He heard the plane flying over the village, and witnessed the bombs being released. Luckily, those bombs did not explode near Malwal. The village was illuminated by the bombs, and many huts caught fire. The villagers knew that the Janjaweed were on their way. Those who could run, began to run for their lives, and those who could not run, waited for their death. Malwal was confused and did not know what was going on. Instead of fleeing, he ran into a nearby hut and took shelter. The hut was filled to capacity with children, women, and old people. It seemed the young men had deserted their families and fled. Malwal tried to converse with the villagers, but none of them understood his language. The only word he heard from them was the Janjaweed. If they had mentioned the name of the devil himself, Malwal would not have been so frightened. While he was in America, he had heard about the many atrocities committed by the Janjaweed. For that reason, his first reaction was to try to escape before the evil ones arrived. Alas, he was too late, for by then, the soldiers of Allah or the troops of Satan had already entered the village, shouting Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. That satanic phrase turned them in wild beasts. They rode on horses' backs and veiled their faces with black turbans. Their guns were in hands ready to shoot. Standing at the hut door, Malwal saw the horses of the Janjaweed entering the village. He didn't know whether to emerge or retreat. The bullets fired at him forced him back into the hut. The children and the women began to scream. Suddenly, the hut was burst into flames. The fire forced Malwal and the poor villagers to come out of the hut and face the Janjaweed, who showed no mercy, showered them all with their deadly bullets. Malwal saw many women, children, and old people fall dead in front of his eyes. He fell on his knees and prostrated, wishing that he had a gun to kill at least one of those devils before they killed him. While he was lying on his stomach and waiting for his death, Malwal saw some horsemen approaching the remaining people. One of them ordered the young girls to separate themselves from the rest. When the girls had stepped aside, the horsemen opened fire on the children, old men, and women, killing, so they thought, all of them. Malwal was mistaken for a dead man and his life was temporarily spared. After the massacre, the Janjaweed began to rape the young women on the open. The young girls screamed and struggled under the bodies of their rapists and abusers. Malwal thought desperately of a way to escape during the raping and pillaging, which followed. History seemed to be repeating itself. It was just like what happened in Khyber city at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, when the Muslim mujahideen raped and shared the Jewish girls openly in orgy, until their Prophet forbade them to rape the pregnant women. In Khyber, the Prophet at least spared the pregnant Jewish women from being raped by his fighters, but who was going to spare the Darfurian girls from those devils? As soon as they finished their wicked deeds, the Janjaweed would set the entire village on fire and burn it to the ground. Malwal realized that if he did not make his escape immediately, he would never go free. He crept slowly along the ground, until he reached a horse. The rider of the horse had likely already discovered whether his paradise of virgins was real. Malwal found a machine gun lying near the horse. Being a trained rebel and soldier, he decided to shoot his way out of that hellish village. He knew his escape required much risk, but he had no other choice. He stood quickly, and jumped on the horse's back. Immediately his machine gun began to shower unsuspecting brutes with bullets. As the horse burst out of the village like a fired rocket, Malwal killed many and made his escape unscathed. The Janjaweed were taken by surprise, and due to the fear of being shot and killed, none dared to pursue Malwal.